truth is rejected because it requires change. Now, I'm here to talk about today something called Juneteenth. As you can see, got a little logo on there, and just gonna drop a little history for those who may not even know. But the American Civil War officially began on April 12th, 1861, when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, I live in South Carolina, and that's a history that, anybody who lives in South Carolina should know. South Carolina started the Civil War. Now, now that we got that fact there out the way, President Abraham Lincoln who was the president at the time, he issued a preliminary proclamation in September 22nd, 1862. Remember, the war started in April 12, 1861. In September 22nd, 1862, he gave the Confederate States, 100 days to cease the rebellion, or he would free the slaves. Now, that's a mean statement right there. Number one, it shows that, President Lincoln was not really willing to continue the war. He wanted the war to stop. He wanted to bring the United States back together, and he was willing to, let the people hold on to the slaves in order to do so. But of course, the people in the South, the Confederates, they didn't want to hear that. They wanted to keep them slaves, which, you got people working for free. We can get into that later and how that relates to today, but, you got free labor. So it's easy to amass a lot of money, when I can have you go out there and work for me while I chill at the house. But anyway, let's move on to the history, right? Now, the Emancipation Proclamation, which we talk about all the time and celebrate, at Juneteenth, actually took effect on January the 1st, 1863. It specifically freed all enslaved black people in the Confederate States. It did not free slaves in the Union States. So you have to remember, in the context of American history, the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the Confederate States, the states that were in rebellion. That's why they call it a Civil War. They rose up and tried to take over the United States, but they failed, and it's all kind of reasons that you can go into, once you look at it, why they failed, other than the fact that they were morally incorrect for what they were trying to do, but beyond that, it did not free the slaves in the Union States, because even though we were fighting against slavery, it still was slavery going on in the Union, even in Washington, D.C. So, people were still enslaved. Now, anyway, back to the history, because we're talking about Juneteenth, right? The Confederacy, but throw a couple of more things out there. The Confederacy officially surrendered on April 9th, 1865. That's when they gave up. They saw, they just couldn't win. And why keep, letting people die if, you couldn't win? Of course, it wasn't but a few days later, on April 15th, 1865, when Lincoln was assassinated. Now, in the process, slaveholders from Confederate states had migrated into Texas to escape the fighting and make a final stand to keep their slaves. Okay, so, Texas was a long way away at that time. We talking about 1865, and just about everybody, is traveling by, I mean, you had rail now, but, just about everybody's traveling by horse and buggy. So, cars didn't exist then. So you got to keep in mind, it might take you a week to get to Texas, but then it might take months. But anyway, they ran to Texas and put up, so they could keep the slaves. Well, on the morning of June 19th, 1865, keep in mind now, Lincoln is already dead, Major General Gordon Granger arrived on the island of Galveston, Texas, which is a nice place if you've ever been there, to take command of around 2,000 federal troops, and his job was to enforce the emancipation of the enslaved population and begin Reconstruction, which, that's another thing to find out. So basically what you have is you have people who were still enslaved even though the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, right? In January, these brothers and sisters were not freed until the Union troops showed up in, June 19th of 1865. And that's why we celebrate Juneteenth. Not so much because we know that the official date was January the 1st, but because these were the last brothers in the Confederate States that were freed. You see, so that's an important part in not only American history, but black history to be specific, because we need to know our history, and we celebrate that history, not celebrate it on January the 1st, which is New Year's Day. We celebrate it on Juneteenth, June the 19th, because on June 19th, 1865, that was when all our people were finally freed. Now, the people in Texas, it was like 1,000 people in Galveston and Houston. They wanted to put up a fight, but them black troops and the white troops that General Gordon had with him, Gordon Granger had with him, they had some serious artillery. They weren't playing no games. So they eventually laid down their arms, freed their slaves, and Reconstruction began from there. Now, it wasn't long, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified on December 18th, 1865, formally abolishing slavery in the United States. That's December 18th, 1865. Okay, so just later that year, Congress made an amendment to the United States Constitution, making sure that it was known that everybody was free. Except, now here's the catch, which you could talk about later, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States except when you're duly convicted of a crime. So, if you've been convicted of a crime, you're a slave according to the United States Constitution, and you really don't have any rights, because once you've been convicted of a crime, whatever state you're in, you belong to that state. You're their property now. But that's a whole nother issue that we can get into later. But we're here to talk about Juneteenth and how it came about and the process that we went through. Now, I have links in the description if you want to, get more into it. But, you have to consider that, when you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. You don't have to tell him to go here or go there. He will find his proper place because his education makes it necessary, So, I always remember that from Carter G. Woodson, because it's easy to condition people, especially if you don't know your history. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. I appreciate you listening to my recitation of the history of Juneteenth. I'm sure a lot of people talk about it. Maybe they don't go into specifics, maybe like I do. I just want you to be aware of your history as Americans, because this is American history. And don't let people cover it up, because, you know, if you don't have a proper education, then that means you're being conditioned, you know. So don't be asleep.